The night air was thick with humidity and the faint scent of diesel from the trucks that rumbled past on the highway. A small diner sat just off the road, its flickering neon signs struggling to stay alive. Inside, the hum of an old refrigerator and the soft clatter of utensils filled the silence between two men seated at a booth near the window. One of them was Detective Frank Delaney, a man who had seen too much and cared too little, or at least that's how he wanted it to seem. The years had left lines under his eyes and a heaviness in his voice. Across from him sat the owner of the diner, Joe Mathers, a broad-shouldered man whose apron was stained with grease and coffee. He looked nervous, his fingers tapping on the counter beside the sugar shaker. Frank's eyes were fixed on the clock above the kitchen door. It was 11:42 p.m. He had been called here 2 hours earlier, right after the shooting. The robbery, as everyone was calling it, had gone bad, or at least that was the story people were telling. A man in a black hoodie had walked into the diner just before closing time. He pulled a gun, demanded cash from the register, and when the young waitress, Emily Carter, tried to reach for her phone, he shot her in the chest. She'd been 24, dead before the ambulance arrived. But something about it didn't fit. Frank had seen robberies. Desperate junkies, masked amateurs, angry kids looking for a thrill. They were messy, unpredictable, and often stupid, but this one was clean. Too clean. The shooter didn't panic. He didn't grab the money. He didn't shout. He just turned, fired one shot, and walked out the back door. No cash taken. No fingerprints. No witnesses who got a good look. That was what bothered Frank most, the purpose. There was intent in that shot. Emily had worked the night shift at that diner for almost 4 years. She was quiet, polite, and hardworking. No criminal record, no known enemies, no reason for someone to hate her. Yet the bullet had found her, like it had been waiting all this time. By morning, the local paper had already written its headline, "Botched Robbery Leaves Local Woman Dead." But Frank wasn't buying it. He went through the diner's security footage for hours. The camera above the counter caught only the edge of the man's hood as he stepped inside. No face, no voice. But when the gun was raised, Frank noticed something small, an odd detail most would miss. The shooter's left hand bore a faint scar across the knuckle. It was thin and jagged, almost like a burn. Frank paused the footage. A memory stirred. 10 years ago, he had investigated a fire at this very diner. It had been ruled an accident caused by faulty wiring, though Joe Mathers swore it was sabotage. His old business partner, a man named Ray Callahan, had accused him of setting it for the insurance money. The accusation tore their partnership apart. Ray lost everything, his job, his savings, even his marriage. A year later, Ray vanished after a bar fight downtown. Frank had written it off as just another life gone sideways. But now, staring at that scar, he remembered something else. Ray Callahan had burned his hand in that very fire trying to save a waitress trapped in the kitchen. Her name had been Emily Carter. Frank's pulse quickened. He rewound the footage, zoomed in again on that scar. 10 years. 10 years since that fire. 10 years since Ray lost everything. 10 years since Emily walked away alive while his life turned to ash. It looked like a robbery. But it wasn't. It was a reckoning. Frank leaned back in his chair and stared out the diner window. The neon sign sputtered again, painting the wet pavement in pale pink light. Joe was wiping down the counter now, trying not to look at him. "You ever hear from Ray Callahan?" Frank asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Joe froze for just a second, just long enough. "Not in years," he said too quickly. "Guy's probably long gone." Frank didn't answer. He just stood, adjusted his coat, and dropped a 20 on the counter. As he stepped outside, the night air felt heavier. The wind carried the scent of rain, and something older, something buried but not forgotten. He looked across the highway where the old auto shop used to be, the one Ray owned before it burned down. The building was long gone, replaced by a gravel lot, but Frank remembered every detail, the scorch marks, the melted tools, the smell of betrayal. He lit a cigarette, even though he'd promised his doctor he'd quit. By morning, Frank was at the old records office downtown, digging through boxes marked 2015. He found the file on the fire, read through the statements again. Ray had blamed Joe for cutting him out of the business deal. Joe had blamed Ray for stealing money. Emily Carter had testified that she saw Ray trying to put out the fire. It was her testimony that cleared Joe's name and ruined Ray's. Now, 10 years later, Emily was dead. The pieces clicked together slowly, painfully, like a lock turning after years of rust. Ray Callahan had come back. That evening, Frank drove to a motel off the interstate, the kind of place that looked abandoned even when the lights were on. Room 7. Paid in cash. Rented for 2 nights. The clerk didn't remember much except the man's burned hand. Frank pushed open the door. The smell hit him first: cheap whiskey, cigarette smoke, and metal. On the bed was a map of the town, the diner circled in red. Next to it lay an old newspaper clipping about the fire. And a photo of Emily Carter, taken from her social media, folded neatly in half. Frank exhaled. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, patrol cars closing in on the highway. Someone must have spotted the man walking west, toward the river. Frank followed them out, his car speeding through the wet streets. He found Ray standing on the old bridge, hood down now, face pale under the sodium lights. The same eyes, the same scar, older but unmistakable. 10 years, Ray said quietly, as if Frank had asked him a question. She lied, Frank. She said she didn't see who started the fire. But she knew. She knew it was Joe. Frank didn't speak. She saved him, and I lost everything. 10 years I carried that. 10 years, and not one of you believed me. Rain started again, soft at first, then harder. Was it worth it? Frank finally asked. Ray looked past him, down at the dark water below. It wasn't about worth. It was about truth. And before Frank could move, before he could reach out, Ray stepped forward into the rain and was gone. By morning, they pulled his body from the river. The local news called it the tragic end of a man consumed by revenge. The diner reopened a week later. Joe replaced the glass, fixed the lights, and told the customers it was time to move on. But Frank knew the truth never really died. It just waited, quiet and patient, like embers under ash. It had looked like a robbery. But it was a 10-year-old grudge finally finding its mark. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment with the lights off, staring at the rain as it traced slow, tired lines down the window. The cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, curling like ghosts that refused to leave. On the table beside him was the old case file, the fire, the statements, the photographs. 10 years ago, he believed what everyone else did, that it was an accident. That Joe was innocent. That Ray Callahan was just bitter and broken. Now, he wasn't so sure. He flipped through Emily's statement again, her words printed neatly in black ink. I saw Ray Callahan trying to put out the fire. It was the detail that cleared Joe. But Frank noticed something this time, a line near the bottom, easy to overlook. Joe told me to wait outside while he checked the office. Joe had been inside first, alone. And minutes later, the building went up in flames. Frank leaned back, exhaling slowly. The case had always bothered him, but back then he'd been new to the department, eager to close files and move up. He'd taken Joe's word because it was easier, because the truth was messy, because sometimes people didn't want justice, they just wanted quiet. But quiet had a way of growing loud when left alone too long. He drove back to the diner the next morning. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and gray. The neon sign buzzed lazily above the door. Inside, Joe was wiping down tables, pretending like nothing had happened. You're early, detective, Joe said, not looking up. Frank dropped the file on the counter. You lied to me. Joe froze. You told me you hadn't heard from Ray in years, Frank continued. But the motel clerk remembers him. Said he came by last week. You know what else I found there? A photo of Emily. And this. He slid the old newspaper clipping across the counter. The headline read, Local business owner cleared in suspicious diner fire. Joe's hand trembled slightly. I don't know what you're getting at. Don't you? Frank's voice was low now, steady and cold. You blamed him for the fire. Took his share of the business, let him go down in flames, figuratively and literally. He lost everything because of you. And now Emily's dead because of what happened back then. Joe's eyes met his, full of something between fear and defiance. You think I set that fire? That's insane. He did it himself trying to collect insurance money. Frank shook his head. Ray didn't have insurance. You did. Silence filled the diner. The sound of the refrigerator buzzed faintly in the background, the only thing alive in that moment. Finally, Joe spoke, his voice small and cracked. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted out. He wouldn't sell his share. I thought if the business was gone, we could both walk away. I didn't know Emily was still inside. Frank's stomach turned. You let him take the blame. He was drunk half the time anyway, Joe said, the edge of guilt melting into bitterness. No one would have believed him. Frank's jaw tightened. He believed himself. For 10 years. Joe looked away. And now he's dead. What does it matter? Frank stared at him for a long moment. He could feel the weight of all those years pressing down. The choices, the lies, the small cruelties people convinced themselves were harmless until they grew into something monstrous. It matters, Frank said quietly, because Emily didn't deserve to pay for what you did. Joe tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Frank turned and walked out, leaving the diner door to slam shut behind him. Outside, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. For a brief moment, it was almost beautiful. But beauty, Frank knew, didn't mean peace. He drove to the station and filed his report. He didn't mention the confession. Didn't mention the words Joe had whispered when he thought no one could hear. There would be time for that later. For now, he just wanted the truth to breathe, after being buried for so long. That night, he stood by the river where they'd pulled Ray's body. The water moved slow and heavy, carrying bits of driftwood and leaves downstream. He tossed his cigarette in and watched it vanish into the current. 10 years, he muttered to himself. All for the price of one lie. Somewhere behind him, thunder rumbled. The town would move on. It always did. The diner would reopen, the headlines would fade, and people would tell themselves it was just another senseless crime. But Frank knew better. It hadn't been senseless at all. It had been deliberate, born from the slow rot of betrayal and guilt. It had worn the mask of a robbery, but underneath, it was something older and uglier. A grudge that had festered too long, until it finally demanded blood. As he walked back to his car, Frank thought of Emily, of Ray, of Joe, all trapped in that decade-long storm of lies. He wished he could say justice had been done, but justice, he'd learned, didn't always arrive in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it came late, in pieces, carried by the rain. And sometimes it came looking like a robbery.